Good morning, good morning. Good morning, everybody. If we could have you all take a seat, that would be greatly appreciated. Everybody grab the rest of their coffee. There is the leaded coffee and the unleaded coffee, and I've had the leaded coffee, so we're good to go. First of all, my name is Tom Bannon. I'm the CEO of the California Apartment Association. I want to welcome everybody here today. I know a number of you have come a long way for this program. Let me give you just sort of a quick, maybe 2-minute overview as to why the California Apartment Association is sponsoring this event. Housing in the state of California obviously is incredibly important. The members of the association provide housing to almost 50% of the population within the state of California. There is a tremendous commitment to housing. Additionally, it is our belief that in order for California to remain strong from an economic vitality perspective, you need to have housing. You can bring in jobs, but if you don't have the housing to match it, it has a tremendous impact on families and individuals throughout the state. You can read all the studies you want, but everybody will tell you that the importance of housing is foundational in families being successful, being healthy. It leads to everything from educational advantages to just moving forward. So today, we've brought together a number of thought leaders from around the state to begin to have the discussion about how do we solve this problem. What I would say to all of you is, just as we see in every other aspect of society, things change, and change is not easy. I would suggest to all of you that the paradigms that we currently think about housing probably have to change. Attitudes probably have to change, and that's not going to happen overnight. And the last thing I would say to you is that hoping that the change will take place isn't going to solve the problem. You know, there's the famous saying, hope is not a method. You have to have hope, but you got to have a plan. And we have a number of disparate interest groups that are impacted either directly or indirectly by housing. Bringing those people together, I'm not going to name all of them because I get myself in trouble, but we got to bring together all of that and see if we can't come up with some specific plan of action to house Californians to keep the economic vitality moving forward. The California Apartment Association, I was talking to a reporter not too long ago, and I talked about the various bills that the California Apartment Association pushed forward. And all of the bills dealt with trying to add supply to the housing markets in California, as well as trying to make it a little easier for people who want to develop housing to, in fact, develop housing. We'll talk more about that later. But the reporter said to me, how come the California Apartment Association is all of a sudden so interested in the supply side versus just the management of housing? And what I told the reporter, and he's here, was I said that we're not going to pack up our buildings and leave the state, but we want to make certain that new development comes in because the existing housing stock cannot house everybody, and particularly those working class families. So I go on, but I'm not going to do that because all of you are going to participate and talk. What I'd like to do is to invite up a gentleman who has done a lot for the state of California. His particular office is the nonpartisan legislative analyst for the state of California. I thought I had a tough job with 15,000 members. He has to deal with Republicans and Democrats and try to find the happy medium and be objective. So The Legislative Analyst's Office just put out, I guess it was in February, the second part of a study that dealt with housing in California, particularly as it relates to low-income housing and affordable housing. And as I said, the paradigm shifts take place. Mac Taylor, the Ledge Analyst, has probably shaken that paradigm to some degree with their report. The Legislative Analyst report is that from a public subsidy perspective, there aren't enough public dollars to provide housing to everybody that needs housing, particularly the low and moderate income folks, and they're an important component. But his notion is we got to push supply, and we agree. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mac Taylor, the Legislative Analyst for the state of California. Mac, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here and inviting me. We did put out two reports, and Tom asked me to sort of briefly recap them. About a year and a half ago, we put out a report called California's High Housing Cost, Causes and Consequences. And then, as he mentioned, just recently we put out one a little bit in response to some of the issues that came up as a result of our first report. So as soon as we get going here. There we go. Well, obviously everybody knows that housing is expensive, but we always like to try to bring some data and analysis to that issue, give you some perspective about just the nature and the extent of the problem that we're dealing with. So I know this is a little hard to see, but basically as of January of 15, these were the median house prices for the 25 largest states. And all you need to know is California there at the top at $437,000 was about 2.5 times higher than the United States average, considerably higher than the next state, Massachusetts. So obviously our housing is incredibly expensive. Now, housing rental costs, because you're concerned not just with people who own homes, but what are the consequences for people that rent. The average rent in 13 was about $840 nationwide. In California, it was almost 50% higher at $1,240. I think it's interesting to see sort of how did this situation develop. And this shows you the dark bars over the decades going back to the 1940s of what our median home prices were compared with the United States average. And you can see back in the 1940s and 50s, we were a little bit higher. But the differential really starts kicking in around the 80s and 90s, whether that was because of a combination, confluence of events of building out a lot of our coastal land, the start of a lot of growth control measures throughout the state. But you can see how the difference really grew dramatically during that time period. Okay, so, well, why is housing so expensive in California? All of you, and some of you know this probably better than I, but there are a lot of factors. Probably the main one is, though, we just build less housing that is demanded, and this is primarily a problem in the coastal areas. We did some analysis comparing our coastal areas with other metro areas throughout the country, and we found, for example, that trying to hold various factors constant, that if you were in the highest quintile of home construction versus the lowest quintile, the lowest 20%, your home prices would be 25% less. So just kind of honing in on just if you built more housing, what is the impact on home prices? That it does have a very significant effect. So clearly we just don't build the kind of housing that is demanded. Obviously we have very high land cost. In 2011, the average per acre cost of residential land in the United States was about $20,000. In California coastal areas, it was $150,000. San Francisco, granted a unique sort of situation, was $400,000. I'm not sure what I should be shooting here. I guess just right there. Little increase in housing densities. So if you don't have vacant land, you can still increase the densities on your developed land. We looked in the 2000s, the decade of the 2000s, And in coastal areas in California, we increased our density slightly, about 4%. If we looked at sort of comparable metro areas throughout the United States, they increased it about 3 times that. So again, the way of trying to accommodate that increased demand. Obviously, we do have higher building costs in the state. We found that our labor costs are about 20% more. We have more extensive building codes and requirements, building standards, than other states. And we have development fees that are about 3.5 times more than the average in the United States. Now, this is an interesting chart because it shows for coastal areas the median price over the last 30 years. And you can see it's grown pretty dramatically. But we wanted to compare that with what California building costs have done over that in the coastal areas. And you can see they've risen somewhat, but it really doesn't explain the rise in home prices. It's a rather small factor that really the reason prices have gone up is we simply can't meet the demand for them, for housing. Okay, so, well, why don't coastal areas build enough housing? Well, once again, of course, there are lots of reasons. Over 2/3 of cities and counties in coastal areas in California have adopted growth control policies. And those are in various forms, as many of you know. They're either caps on housing or the way that they zone for land or whatever. But an extensive number of them have adopted growth control policies. Project reviews can be very slow, cumbersome. Takes about 2/3 longer just to issue a building permit. About 1/3 longer to rezone, so it is just more difficult to build. And there's a very high degree of voter involvement through either initiative, referendums, votes by people on local projects. We looked at the 2000 election nationwide, and we found that just under half of all growth management-related initiatives, referendums, things like that, were in California. So obviously we have a very active local citizenry in their involvement in decision-making regarding housing. All right, so CEQA is always mentioned as another factor. And we did look at CEQA, and we found that over a decade of looking at 10 of our largest cities, it took on average 2.5 years to approve projects requiring an EIR. So that's a fairly extensive time period for a builder trying to get a project done. All right, obviously there's limited developable land in California. If you think about our topography in our state, again, if we're talking about coastal areas, we've got the coastal range going up and down the state. So about 2/3 of the area surrounding them is just undevelopable basically because of grade. And that compares with just under 1/4 for other US metro areas. So we do have a significant physical constraint. We have limited vacant land. We have about 1% of land in coastal areas that is both vacant and developable. So that's not a lot as far as building afresh. And then there's, as we've sort of talked about already, there's community decisions on the way that they do their planning, their general plans, their housing elements, that can limit the amount of housing that can be built. So one of the key things I think that we did in our report was try to give you some estimates of just how big is our housing shortage. Now that can be partly a normative issue, but we tried to posit a standard, and it was, what if our housing prices had only grown as fast as the rest of the country's? What level of housing would we have needed to build in past decades in order to keep our prices, not from being stagnant, but only growing as fast as the rest of the country? So it's just one standard. I think it's sort of an interesting measure. And this chart is sort of the key findings of our analysis. The black bars, the lower part of each one, for the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, shows you the amount of new housing units that we actually built. It averages just over 110,000 a year over those 3 decades. The top bar, the add-on, the light shaded bar, is the additional units we would have had to have built if we wanted to keep prices in line with the rest of the United States. And you can see that it's basically we had to almost double the actual housing that we built. Over 100,000 units a year, every year for those 30 years. And I know a lot of you can't see this one. It's a really interesting chart, though. It takes that same analysis about what if you only had kept prices in line with the rest of the U.S., if prices in a particular metro area had only risen at the U.S. average. But just to help you out here, at the top bar is Los Angeles. The light shade, which is about 20,000 units a year, is what they actually build in Los Angeles over that 30-year period. The black bar, which is about 55,000 units a year, is what they would have needed to build to keep prices growing at only the U.S. average. And what's interesting, of course, is that all of the coastal counties are on the top part of the chart, where their shortfall, in effect, between the estimated need and what they actually build are dramatic, particularly in the Bay Area. And that on the bottom are the inland counties, either in the Central Valley or in the Inland Empire, where, without exception, they built more units than what they needed to meet their sort of local demand. Now, it's sort of a conceptual model, because what happens is the Riversides, the Inland Empire, the Central Valley has absorbed some of the people who were not accommodated up above in the coastal areas. All right, so what are the consequences of our expensive housing? And I think, many of you obviously would be aware of most of these, but I don't think we actually think about all of the consequences of what happens when you have very expensive housing. One of the most important ones, of course, is the impact on low-income people. And in California's major metros, we're all significantly less affordable than the bottom bar, which is the major metros in other states. So people pay a much higher proportion of their income towards housing in California. It's also very interesting of the impact that has on all of the discussion about poverty. If you look on the left, the dark bar is California's under the traditional poverty measurement. The percentage of people who are considered poor, 16%. It's not really much different from the national average. There is now being circulated and considered an alternative so-called supplemental poverty measure, which is on your right. And under that measure, California has a much higher percentage of poor people. And it's because they take into account our housing prices. So just another way that obviously we know, but intuitively, but the consequences, again, on low-income people in particular. All right, there's a lot of other consequences of having expensive housing, though. People have to commute further to work. There's a lot of people that move into the Inland Empire from the Bay Area to Tracy or Modesto, from the Los Angeles area into the Inland Empire. In order to seek housing, you have to drive further. It discourages people from living in California. Now, for some people, that might be considered a positive thing, but it's not good for our mobility, for our economic dynamism, that people can't come who would contribute to our state. And if we had housing prices growing at more like the national average, we would have a lot more people in the state. There's no question about it. That says employers, but it's actually employees, even though it does apply to employers too. But it can be much more difficult to recruit employees, and you've all heard the stories about it, particularly in the Bay Area, the Silicon Valley. But it's true in other parts of the coastal areas as well. Fewer Californians work in our most productive cities. Some of our cities are great economic places to work. They have what economists call agglomeration economies. They're very efficient. They can be very productive. If people can't live there, productive workers can't come and live there, you lose economic output. And you have falling home ownership rates. California has very low home ownership rates compared to the nation. Not surprising, given our home prices. It's particularly hard on people under age 30, whose home ownership rates over the last 30 years has dropped in half. It used to be around a quarter owned homes. Now it's like 12%. There's also, and I didn't raise this, but obviously there's overcrowding issues too when you have expensive housing. Californians there's a much higher level of overcrowding in the state. Okay, so what are the conclusions of our first report? Well, first of all, obviously you got to build a lot more housing in coastal areas. And I think we just felt like the only way we're going to do this if you engage the private sector in building market rate housing. And we'll get a little bit into the other side of that in just a second. We just said, look, you're not going to solve this through one thing. You're not just going to change CEQA. You're not just going to change the relationship between the state and the locals. You're going to have to do a lot of things in order to meet this. So we just said, you really need to consider a whole vast array of policy solutions if you're going to make a dent into our housing problem. And finally, we certainly recognize the role of affordable housing. The state has always had a role in helping those that there's no way the private sector is going to address certain housing problems. We've provided homelessness money for shelters, for operating expenses. We've run migrant housing. We've had housing bonds for low, moderate income housing. Just this past budget cycle, we're putting a $2 billion bond to provide homeless people that have mental health problems. So there's always a key role for the state, and we think that it should continue. So we didn't view as there being any tension in that regard. We just felt like this problem that we had went way beyond just the state subsidizing certain units, and that was going to be able to sort of buy our way out of this problem. So when the report came out, I think there were legitimate issues that some people raised about maybe not so much what we said, but maybe some of the implications of what we said. And I think there were concerns like, well, the benefits, if you're just going to rely heavily on market rate, you're going to benefit higher income people, you're not going to benefit lower income people. And there's certainly a legitimate concern if you're building market rate housing, particularly in the coastal areas and highly dense areas, you're going to have some displacement issues. So obviously, very legitimate issues. So in our second report, we first talked about the challenges of expanding existing programs. Not saying you shouldn't do it, but this is what Tom mentioned in his opening remarks. Just to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, we had some evidence that the public subsidies on affordable housing tended to be over $165,000 a unit. That's pretty heavy. If you were to build affordable housing for the 1.7 million people, renters, who pay more than 50%, not all low income, but who pay more than 50% of their income towards rent, it would cost you over $250 billion, which is an enormous amount of money, obviously. Alternatively, well, you could think about, well, we should just expand our voucher programs to give low-income people the money to be able to buy or to find rental accommodations. Similarly, we found that if you were to give the 2.5 million people who pay more than 30%, there's a lot of people paying obviously a lot more than that in California, but just covered those people who are paying more than 30%, it would cost you $20 billion each year, which I'm just not sure how the state budget could accommodate that. You could make the case we should still do it. The problem, of course, if you go the voucher routine is it's actually not going to get you there, because if you're not building more units, they're just going to bid up the rents on the existing stock. It'll cost you more and more for each voucher, and I'm not sure what you get out of it. So we just found like you're not going to get there solely through subsidized housing. And we also wanted to address the concerns that people legitimately had raised. One was, well, does building more housing, regardless of the type of housing you build, does it help low-income people? And so we looked at a lot of things. I've just picked one chart, and it showed the rents paid by low-income housing along the California coast, and you can see how they went up between 1980 and 2013 on the left side. And we compared that with other U.S. counties with the most home building, and you can see that the increase in the rents over that 30-year period was significantly less. So obviously, when you do build more housing, you do have a filtering down, that other homes are available for other people, just like many of you probably have if you live in a home, may live in a used home. My first home was probably owned by 4 or 5 different people. The home I'm in now was owned by 1 or 2 other families before I used it. That's the way the housing and all other type of markets work. So while, sure, there are other issues related to if you just build market rate, clearly building more housing dampens the pressure on prices that everyone pays for their housing, and it has great social benefits. The other issue was on, I sort of skipped over, let's see, on displacement. People, again, legitimately concerned about displacing low-income people if you build market rate in certain places. So we again tried to take a look at it. Was that true? And if you look on the left about looking at all communities in the Bay Area, we found that the displacement, which is on the y-axis, the amount of market rate housing construction when there was low, you had fairly high displacement. And when you had high construction, you had much less displacement. So then we thought, well, some people say that's maybe because in the Bay Area you have lots of inclusionary housing. So we tried to get the same cut at it, even with those communities without inclusionary housing policies, and we found basically the similar result. You build more housing, you actually have less overall displacement. So let me just end with a few comments. Obviously, this is long on problem identification, short on specific remedies. I take it that's what you're going to be spending the rest of your day on. We're very, very aware of how these housing issues involve incredibly sensitive issues. You're dealing with state-local governance issues. What is the appropriate state role versus what has traditionally been a strong local control over housing, zoning, planning, general use policies. You're dealing with property rights. You're dealing with people's preferences about their homes and neighborhoods, which people have obviously great attachment to, great sensitivity about. So this is kind of a combustible mix that you're dealing with, and I think that's what makes it so hard. But I guess the bottom line for us is, and I think really echoing some of Tom's comments, we need to build more housing. We need to make it easier to build more housing, to accommodate people, to keep prices down, to make housing more affordable, particularly for lower income people. And I think even those of you in the audience who deal with affordable housing, I think basically most of the major problems are the same that you face that the private side faces. We just have to make it easier to build housing. So with that, Tom, I don't know if there's time for a few comments or questions. If not, I'll. Thank you very much.